With Path of Exile patch 3.9 being more boss-centric, I wanted to create a build that would melt bosses but also have at least decent clear. For that, I chose Purifying Flame's Mines. Mines are a well-known boss-killing mechanic due to the fact that you can preload your damage to burst bosses down. I wanted to find a skill that worked in both single target and for clear, and Purifying Flame hit that mark. Purifying Flame is a physical spell with 50% inbuilt conversion to fire. It fires out a wide beam that is ground targeted. It creates consecrated ground around where it exploded on the ground and then causes a ripple which travels through all consecrated ground over a large area. As a miner, you can tend to be on the squishy side, and so I wanted to try and get as much survivability as I could without sacrificing the damage potential, since the goal was to melt bosses. A Path of Building Pastebin link is in the description if you want a more in-depth look at exactly how I set up the character. As always, this is how I have set up the character and is not set in stone. Any part of the build can be changed to your own liking depending on your needs. For the passive tree, it is a fairly standard crit mine tree with a few tweaks. Acro and phase acro add a lot of survivability to the build, since our main sources of defense will be avoidance. There are quite a few good clusters to pick up right nearby, since we are already getting acro. The witch part of the tree is where the other part of our defenses come from. We use 2 intuitive leaps to pick up some nice notables which save us a bunch of passive points. We also get a bunch of mana nodes to go along with our mind over matter. For Ascendancy, the blind node adds a ton of survivability as it stacks along with our dodge and evasion for another layer of avoidance. Pyromaniac adds some life regen and ignite and shock immunity. The final 2 Ascendancy nodes are just for raw damage and some area of effect. The gem link setup is quite flexible, so you can use whichever setup you prefer. First, blast chain support versus high impact support. If you can guarantee the mines to be placed directly underneath the mob, and you don't mind pressing D a lot, then high impact is the better choice. If you want to press D less, and tend to not place the mines directly under the mob, if you are trying to off-screen a scary mob in Dell for instance, then blast chain support is the one for you. The next option is between Swift Assembly, Minefield and Charged Mines. This is your utility slot and will depend on which you prefer. Minefield will be the slowest, but will give you much better coverage whilst mapping, as the Purifying Flames will spread the consecrated ground over a much larger distance for the ripple to travel through. Swift Assembly is in the middle. It does not have a mine throw speed penalty and has the chance to throw multiple mines out at a time. Lastly, Charged Mines is the fastest mine throwing speed and gives you access to frenzy charges. This is my preferred option here. Purifying Flame doesn't need that many mines thrown to get good coverage whilst mapping. Going with Charged Mines makes the mine throwing speed so fast that you will oftentimes end up throwing 2 to 3 mines out at a time anyway. Having faster mine throw speed also helps if you need to dodge boss mechanics. The last 3 links are pretty much set in stone. Due to gearing, which I will go over shortly, we are focusing on the level of Purifying Flame to push its damage output. As such, a level 4 or 3 depending on budget and power, along with a level 5 Awakened added fire, will add a bunch of levels to Purifying Flame. The last link will be the highest more multiplier, which is Trap and Mine damage support. If you get lucky on your colours, you can have a concentrated effect swap-in over Trap and Mine damage support for single target, since concentrated effect is a slightly higher multiplier. The next important link is the Wave of Conviction setup. This setup is designed to shred the most resistances possible when facing tough rares and bosses. For this setup, we use Wave of Conviction linked with Combustion, Curse on Hit, Elemental Weakness. This setup will shred 44% of resistances from the Curse and then an additional 44% fire res from the Wave of Conviction. You can use Flammability over Elemental Weakness if you are going for a pure fire build. For mobility, we use Flame Dash, Smoke Mine, linked with Increased Duration and Arcane Surge. Learning the smoke mine into flame dash movement will make clearing go a whole lot faster. A cast when damage taken is linked with steel skin. The level of cast when damage taken is up to you. I choose to have it at about a third of my life pool. The last three skills are Vol Righteous Fire, which is a big damage boost on bosses, Herald of Ash, which is mandatory for our gearing, and Skitterbots for permanent chill and shock on bosses. Any remaining slots can be used for whatever you prefer. You can use a decoy totem, more cast and damage taken setups, or another Vol skill or two. The choice is up to you. Now onto gearing. There are 4 required items for the build. The first being a Circle of Anguish ruby ring. This ring is the most damage potential from a ring slot for this build. The Herald of Ash buff effect is the most important mod on the ring. The other mod is once again personal preference. Fire resistance if you want an easier time gearing. Max fire resistance if you have sources of physical damage taken as fire damage, or mana reservation if you want to increase your mana pool for survivability. I went with the damage option, which is the most expensive option, but extra damage is not required, only the Herald of Ash buff effect mod is. The other ring slot is for an Essence Worm. This is to give us a usable mana pool for Mind Over Matter to work. We place Skitterbots here since they have the highest mana cost. The other slots which are mandatory are for the bow and quiver slots. For bow, we are after a rare crafted bow with +1 to the level of socketed gems. Socketed gems deal 20% more spell damage, and the Katarina Benchcraft +2 to the level of socketed support gems. To craft this bow, first you need the bow itself. This is from the divination card, the Porcupine. This gives an item level 50 6-link short bow. I use an Aetheric Fossil to get the 20% more spell damage mod, with a Corroded and Metallic Fossil to remove almost all prefixes except for the +2 gems, and the Delve Poison mod for the Corroded Fossil. The end goal bow will be +1 to socketed gems, 20% more spell damage, +2 socketed support gems for the prefixes, and then +1 intelligence gems and +1 strength gems suffixes. This is crafted the same way, but with the addition of a faceted fossil to get the +intelligence and +strength suffixes. The quiver slot is a signal fire, since it can give up to 35% physical damage as extra fire damage. Getting one of these along with as extra fire, cold or lightning corruption will be best in slot. I chose for additional cold to help with mapping for freezes and shatter. The rest of the gear is all just rares, initially prioritizing life, mana and resistances. Getting other stats in these slots are all luxury items and are not required for the build. For gloves, any of the temple mods are really good for this build since we can apply all 3 ailments. Culling Strike and Spell Damage are both Warlord influence mods, and will be better damage-wise over a temple modded pair of gloves. Finally, getting Culling Strike, along with the Hunter's mod chance to unearth enemies for 4 seconds on hit, will end up being the best in slot gloves. For boots, there is the potential to get Tailwind and or Elusive if you find a way to constantly keep them up using your spare sockets. Otherwise, this is a big slot to cap your resistances. For Helm, the Consecrated Ground from Purifying Flame applies 9% increased damage taken to enemies enchant, is the best for bossing since it acts as a 9% more multiplier for single target. You can also use the Purifying Flame deals 40% increased damage enchant at a much lower cost. As for rolls, a Scorched Fossil craft with nearby enemies have -9% to fire resistance adds more resistance shred if you are nearby to enemies. Warlord influence can roll increased elemental damage, +1 to maximum power charge, and physical damage taken as fire damage for some survivability. For chest, a hunter influence chest can roll up to 12% increased maximum life along with base spell crit. A crusader chest with enemies killed explode dealing 3% of their life as physical damage will substantially increase clear speed. As for uniques, there is Carcass Jack, which gives some area and area damage along with some resistances. You can also use Calm's Heart for some more flat life if you want to push your life pool higher. For the belt, a rare with life and resistances will generally be used. Other options include a Warlord's Influence belt for fire damage and life recovery, or a Stygian Fossil crafted with fire damage and elemental damage. For the amulet, a life, crit multi, fire damage neck is a fairly cheap start. Warlord Influence adds +1 to fire skills, up to 15% physical damage as extra fire damage, and up to 10% fire pen. Hunter Influence adds +1 to intelligence gems, and up to 6% elemental pen. The best amulet would be a Warlord Hunter double influence with +1 to all fire and +1 to intelligence gems, along with either crit multi or the physical damage gained as extra fire damage Warlord modifier. The choices for these slots are varied, and so it's up to you to choose which you prefer depending upon your budget and playstyle. You can go full DPS, sacrificing defenses to push the most damage, or you could go to the other extreme and stack all the defenses to be a fairly survivable miner. Flasks are also a personal choice, as there are many options to use. An Enduring Eternal Mana Flask is the best mana flask of choice. Enduring lets your flask effect sustain even when at full mana. This lets you stack up lots of uses of the flask for quite a lot of mana regen. If running a life flask, Blood of Curry Sanctified Life Flask is the best life flask. We have so much life regen from Pyromaniac and Consecrated Grounds that combined with the Blood of Curry, the life recovery feels almost instant. A Quicksilver will almost always be used, which makes mapping much faster. A Quartz Flask can be used to give phasing whilst mapping and is especially useful in Delve. A Diamond Flask can be used to grant lucky crits. A Basalt Flask can be used to give some physical damage reduction, which comes in handy for the times where you do get hit. The Katarina Flask craft for crit chance during flask effect can be crafted onto any non-unique flask. Taste of Hate is a good defensive flask for the 20% physical damage taken as cold, as well as some extra cold damage to help with the freeze and shatter. Bottled Faith adds base spell crit, since mobs will always be underneath Consecrated Ground. Wise Oak can be used if you want to try and balance resistances to get both effects of the flask. Azira's Promise gives you some chaos resistance along with a lot of extra chaos damage. The choice is yours to make depending on your needs and budget. Overall, the Purifying Flame Miner is an incredible boss killer without compromising on clear. General mapping feels fairly smooth, and bosses don't live long enough to pose a threat. The variety of gearing choices gives you many options and directions to take the build, from a speedy mapper to an absolute monster boss deleter.